The Squarebill crankbait has literally won millions of dollars for professional anglers. I mean, Kevin Van Dam alone has probably won almost $1 million on this little bad boy right here. And it is by far one of the best tools that we have as anglers to go out and catch bass. Today, I want to go in depth and go over everything that there has to do with a Squarebill crankbait so that you will be more comfortable throwing it this year. This video is brought to you by the Bruin Cooler. As you guys know, I use Bruin reels, but something that I also use is a Bruin cooler. Now, my bass boat actually has a cooler in it, but it's nowhere near as good at keeping ice and keeping things cold as this Bruin cooler right here. Not only do you have a bunch of different colors when it comes to these coolers, but you also have soft coolers if you're a soft cooler guy or girl, and you have your hard coolers. I'm gonna leave some links down below in the description. If you're looking for a cooler, click those links down below and you're greatly gonna help support the Bass Fishing HQ channel. Now, back to the video. Now, whether you're just getting started in bass fishing or whether you've been fishing your entire life, you probably have heard of a Squarebill crankbait because, again, it's truly one of the best lures that we have as fishermen to not only catch bass, but to actually find bass. And so with that being said, I think that every fisherman should really know the ins and outs of the Squarebill. A lot of guys like to know about gear when it comes to fishing a Squarebill. So I'm gonna talk about that first, and then we're gonna talk about when to fish it, where to fish it, and how to fish it. No matter what brand reel that you like, I really like something in that 6-speed range. As for instance, this is a 6.2 to 1 gear ratio. I would kind of consider that like a medium speed reel. It's just something that I've had a lot of success on, something that I've done a lot when it comes to fishing a crankbait. Now, this particular reel that I have here is a Bruin ELS reel. Now, there are times where I like to use a faster reel, something like a 7.1 to 1 gear ratio. Typically that's in the summer, but we will talk about that a little bit later when we talk about the when and where of Squarebills. You're probably gonna hear a lot of different opinions as far as a rod goes for a Squarebill crankbait. I have fished with a ton of different rods over the years, rods that were full glass, rods that were graphite, and the composite rods. And I really have kind of honed in on fishing the composite rods because I feel like you kind of have the best of both worlds with that composite rod. Something that I love about glass rods is that they really have a true parabolic bend to them, and it's actually very hard for a bass to get off once you get them hooked, which is one of the big things that people hate about using treble hook lures and crankbaits is that you're going to lose a lot of fish. Now, the thing about a true glass rod is you typically don't have the best feel with that rod, and they tend to be heavy. Now, on the other hand, with graphite, sometimes you actually feel too much. Sometimes you feel that bass hit that bait a little bit too quick in some situations, and therefore you set the hook and the bass don't typically get that bait as well. So I really like a composite rod. Now, this particular rod here is my favorite because it is the lightest composite rod that I have ever fished with. And this is it's an arc rod, it's a Tharp series rod, and it's called the Grinder. As far as the rod length goes, this is a 7-foot rod. I really think 7 foot is just kind of an all-around great rod. You know, you can really precision target cast along the bank, and you can also make really long casts offshore. And I do both of those a lot with a Squarebill crankbait. Now, the next component of your equipment is the fishing line itself. I always throw fluorocarbon line when I'm fishing a Squarebill. Now, as far as the line diameter goes, the pound test, I'm usually using like 12 pound to 15 pound. When I change is really dependent on whether I'm trying to keep that lure higher in the water column and the cover that I'm fishing around. If I'm fishing around a lot of wood and heavy cover situations, I'm gonna use that 15-pound line. That way, if I do hook up with a fish, I can kind of horse him out of that cover before he gets too bogged down in it. Now, when it comes to the crankbait itself, pretty much every brand out there has their own Squarebill crankbait, and I like a lot of them. I've tried several. I haven't tried all of them, but I always end up coming back to the KVD 1.5, the 2.5, and the 1.0. This is the 1.5. This is my all-around go-to crankbait. You know, anytime I feel like I'm gonna throw a Squarebill, I'm gonna pick up a 1.5 just like this. I believe this is the exact color and everything that KVD was using when he won the Bass Bassmaster Classic on the Louisiana Delta. And I try to keep my colors simple for the most part. I like a chartreuse black back. I like some sort of shad pattern crankbait like the one that we got here, and then some sort of crawl crankbait. You know, this one is actually a 1.5 that I custom painted, but another crawl pattern is this guy right here. This is actually the 2.5. I'll throw these crawl patterns a lot of times during the spring of the year. Now later in this video, we're gonna talk about speed cranking, and I like to do that for smallmouth, especially in clear water. And this is a little baby that I use a lot, which is this perch colored 1.5 to do that speed cranking with. For the most part, I like to keep these colors pretty simple: shad patterns, crawl patterns, and chartreuses. I probably pick up the 1.5 most of the time, but for me, I fish a lot of highly pressured bodies of water, and because of that, I'll pick up this little guy, which is a 1.0 a lot as well. A little bit smaller crankbait can get you a lot of bites. This little crankbait is pretty small, but it will catch some big fish, especially in highly pressured bodies of water. I also like to use this when the water is really cold. If that water is kind of in the upper 40s, low 50s, a lot of times I'm gonna pick up this smaller crankbait because it just doesn't put out quite as much vibration, and I think the bass hone in on it a little bit better because it's not too much for them. You know, the 2.5 is another great bait that I pick up a lot of times, especially when I'm fishing in really muddy water. As you can see, it's a bigger bait. It's probably twice as big as the 1.5, so it's gonna put out a lot of vibration. It's gonna put out a bigger water displacement, and that way it helps those fish in that muddy water kind of track this bait down. Now, the thing that I like about it is it's not too big. There are some really big Squarebills, like an 8.0. I don't have a ton of experience throwing those big Squarebills, but I like the 2.5 because I can still catch, you know, keeper size fish as well as obviously bigger fish with it. Now, that is another time that I'm gonna fish a 2.5 is when I'm fishing around bigger fish, bigger average fish. And you know, if you're fishing a Lake Gunnersville or Lake Chickamauga, I might pick up that 2.5 more than the other baits just because it has a bigger presence. Those are probably my favorite all-around Squarebills that I use a lot. I also use a little bait like a Berkeley Fritz side, which is kind of like a Squarebill crankbait. It's a flat-sided crankbait. And I also use some Lucky Craft Squarebills quite often. And guys, just so you know, I'm gonna link all the tackle and equipment I just talked about down below in the description. There are lures on the market where it seems like certain water temperatures or water clarities can work better for that lure than others. And to be honest, with a Squarebill, I don't think that a Squarebill kind of falls into a certain water temperature or water clarity. It really depends on how you fish it. Now, the big thing when it comes to fishing a Squarebill is, you know, I typically don't want water that is very silent. You know, if you pull into a pocket or you're on the main lake and it's really clear water and it's really still outside, there's no wind, there's no chop on the water, that's not optimal conditions for throwing moving baits in general, and definitely not for a Squarebill. Typically, if I'm fishing a Squarebill in clearer water, I usually want some sort of chop on the water. I want a little bit of a ripple. I want something to break up the surface. Another thing is shade. You know, sometimes you can catch fish in clear water around shade lines with a Squarebill. So having shade or having a little bit of a ripple is something that you definitely want. Now, if you're fishing a little bit more off-color water, like you see behind me, whether it's stained or whether it's muddy, you sometimes don't need to have a chop on the water or shade. Sometimes the bass are going to eat that Squarebill well, even in still conditions, just because that water clarity kind of cuts down on the visibility that the bass have. But as far as water temperatures, I think anything above 50 degrees, whether it's right at 50 and all the way up to, you know, really warm water like 90, 92 degree water, a Squarebill can work. Now, when it comes to where to fish a Squarebill, this is kind of the meat of this video. This is going to be the longer part of this video because there are certain situations that I really like to fish a Squarebill during certain times of the year, whether it's pre-spawn or post-spawn or summer or fall. There are certain situations where I love fishing a Squarebill, and I'm actually going to go through kind of a calendar year and really tell you where I like to throw a Squarebill. Before we talk about where to find pre-spawn bass, I want to talk real quick about another company I've partnered with this year, and that is the Deep Dive app. This app can really cut down on the time that it takes to find bass. This app is actually based on a lot of data that comes from different tournaments across the nation over the last several years. When you get to the water, simply select the lake that you are fishing, it's actually going to pull in the weather for that lake automatically. As of right now, there are over 1,300 different lakes that are in this app. And if your lake is not in there, you can actually request it to be put in this app. And then you're going to select whether the water is clear, stained, or dirty. You can select the water degree temperatures, whether or not you're fishing in windy conditions or protected conditions, and whether that lake has vegetation or no vegetation. After you make those selections, the app is actually going to give you several different lures and patterns that can help you to locate bass faster on your body of water. It's a very cool app, and I'm going to leave a link for this app down below in the description. The pre-spawn is probably one of the best times to throw a Squarebill. This is that time frame before the bass really move up real shallow and get on their beds. Typically the pre-spawn is going to be when you have water temperatures between about 50 and 60 degrees. Now it seems like during this time of the year, bass tend to like having vibration. You know, this is a time of the year where a chatterbait can be really good. This is a time of the year where a lipless crankbait can be really good. And the same thing is true with a Squarebill. Now when it comes to where I like to fish that Squarebill during the pre-spawn, one of the best things that you can do is actually look at where you think bass are going to spawn, whether that's pockets or maybe that's bays on a natural lake, and actually kind of start working out towards where you think they winter. Now really any piece of structure and or cover that you run into when you go from kind of those spawning areas out is going to be a great place to throw a Squarebill. For instance, this could be a creek channel swing bank. A lot of times that last creek channel swing bank before that pocket kind of flattens out can be a kind of a holding place for bass before they go up and spawn in this pre-spawn time frame. Now whether that creek channel swing has rock on it or wood or both, that can be a great area to throw that Squarebill around and fish around that visible cover. Now if you move out just a little bit further from the spawning pockets, one of my favorite places to throw a Squarebill is on those secondary points that are leading into that spawning pocket. If you have some stained water and some rock on those secondary points, those bass can kind of hang on those points before they actually move up there to spawn. If you're fishing in natural lake, sometimes bass are going to spawn up on really shallow flats, something in that 3 to 6 foot zone around boulders or rock. Now a lot of natural lakes, you tend to have clearer water and you tend to have vegetation. So like I talked about with clear water, I usually want some sort of chop on that water to kind of break up that surface to really help those bass kind of commit to a Squarebill a little bit better. Now in natural lakes, a great place where bass are kind of going to stage before they go up and spawn is simple grass clumps. This could be milfoil, this could be coontail, this could be hydrilla. Now a lot of people are going to see these grass clumps and they're going to think about a chatterbait and they're going to think about a lipless crankbait or even a jerkbait, and those are great options, but something that's really overlooked is fishing that Squarebill around those grass clumps. A couple of years ago, this is exactly what Brian New did down on Lake Toho in a Bassmaster Open. A lot of guys, including myself, were fishing hydrilla clumps out in front of spawning pockets. A lot of guys were throwing the typical chatterbaits, jerkbaits, and lipless crankbaits, but Brian New threw a Squarebill. It was something different, and because of that, he caught a lot more fish and a lot bigger fish, and he won himself like $50,000. Now, it's important to know that when you're fishing a crankbait, a Squarebill crankbait around grass clumps, you don't have to be hitting the bottom. You know, a lot of times when I fish a Squarebill, I like to be hitting rock bottom, or I like to be deflecting it off wood cover and really digging into the bottom. When you're fishing grass, I do like to hit that bait along the grass, but I don't necessarily like to get it hitting on the bottom. There's actually a man-made lake that I live close to, but part of this lake really kind of sets up more like a natural lake. It's very flat, it's got a lot of pads around it, and one of the things that I love to do is fish a really small crankbait through those pads early in the year, and I catch a lot of bass doing that when other guys are throwing baits like chatterbaits and lipless crankbaits. Now when it comes to the spawn is typically going to be that water temperature between about 60 and 70 degrees, and typically when you have fish that are spawning, a Squarebill crankbait is not the best way to catch them. Now this is not always true. As a matter of fact, if you are fishing around very stained or muddy water, sometimes a squarebill can catch fish that are actually spawning, that are on beds. This is actually how we saw Kevin Van Dam win the Bassmaster Classic on the Louisiana Delta. He was targeting stumps on a big flat where bass were spawning, and he was casting a Squarebill crankbait in there and catching fish that were actually setting up on beds. Now, moving on to the post spawn, this is typically when you have water temperatures around that 70 to 80 degree range. Now, something that happens in a lot of lakes in that post spawn time frame is a shad spawn. The shad are going to come up, and they actually tend to spawn on hard objects, but one of the places that you can typically find a shad spawn happening is on rock and riprap banks. Now, that shad spawn typically only lasts for a couple hours in the morning, so if you want to take advantage of this, you're going to have to get up early, and you're going to have to fish in those low light conditions when those shad are really active and up spawning on the bank. Now, there are other lures like spinner baits and swim jigs that really can work well during a shad spawn, but a squarebill is just, again, it's a bait that some guys don't think to throw, and it can catch a lot of bass during that post-spawn time of the year. Now, when you get into the summer months, what I have found is that a lot of guys tend to put a squarebill down. They stop throwing it, maybe they start throwing deeper lures or topwater lures, and they put that squarebill down. And I'm telling you what, that is a mistake. One of my absolute favorite ways to catch bass during the summer is by speed cranking a squarebill. Now, typically when I am doing this, I am fishing around grass and clear water. If you have those situations, and that can happen in a pond, a natural lake, or on a reservoir, speed cranking is an overlooked way to catch a lot of bass. Now, the big thing here, like I talked about, you typically want a little bit of a chop on the water. You want something to kind of break it up. Maybe it's a cloudy day, a little bit of a chop. You want something to break up that water. You don't want to do this in still conditions. Now, a big thing here is your reel. This is typically when I go from that 6.2 to 1 up to that 7.1 to 1 gear ratio, because I am literally going to be cranking a squarebill just about as fast as you can. Now, I found this to be extremely effective when fishing, obviously for largemouth, but also for smallmouth. Now, perfect scenario for this pattern is, finding a hump that has, maybe 8 foot of water on top, and it has grass clumps that are growing up maybe within about 3 to 4 foot of the surface. Now, I'm gonna cast that crankbait out there, and I'm literally gonna be ripping this thing as fast as I can, letting it get in the grass, snatching it out, ripping it out, keep on cranking it. In that speed cranking, I'm telling you, it's a very overlooked pattern for catching smallmouth bass and largemouth. Now, if you don't have a clear body of water with grass, another thing that you can do during the summer months is actually go really, really shallow and fish a squarebill in dirty water. There's always going to be a population of bass that stay shallow. They're gonna stay up in creeks. They're gonna typically relate to wood cover or rock cover, but they're gonna be really shallow. I mean, even in the hottest part of the year. A lot of times I tend to target those bass with Texas rigs and top waters like a buzzbait, but a squarebill is another great option during the middle of summer in the hottest weather, way up in some of these creeks. Now, as summer kind of starts to turn into fall, this can be a very tricky time of the year to go out and just catch a bass. A lot of bass have seen lures. You have oxygen in a lake that's being depleted by the turnover. You have a lot of things that are going on, and what I have found is that really up until that water temperature starts to dip back into that 50-degree range, I don't really fish a squarebill a ton. Now, I'm not saying that it won't work. I'm just saying that I typically fish other lures until that water starts to creep into the 50s. Once it starts hitting, 57, 56, 55, in that 50-degree range, the squarebill becomes a great bait to catch a lot of bass. Now, the thing about the fall is that in the fall, you have bass everywhere. You have bass that are relating to the main body of water that you're fishing. You have bass that have gone up into the creeks. And so when it comes to where I like to fish that squarebill, it's everywhere. If I'm fishing a main lake hump and it's only 5 or 6 foot of water on top where I can kind of get that squarebill down, that could be a great place to catch bass. Now, if I get up into a creek and there's a creek channel swing bank, or there's a bank that has some big stumps on it, those are other great places to fish a squarebill. The big thing here is just fish it everywhere, because what I've seen often when it comes to fishing in that later fall period is that fish will actually kind of suspend in the water columns. For instance, you might be fishing a stump that's in 4 or 5 foot of water, and you might fish it with a jig, but those fish actually might be off the bottom a couple of feet, relating to bait fish that are in that area. So fishing a squarebill a little bit higher in the water column during the fall can be a deadly way to catch a lot of bass. Now, when it comes to how to fish a squarebill, probably the biggest thing to know is deflection. Deflecting that squarebill off of cover, whether it's grass, whether it's a log, whether it's rock, is probably what's going to get you more bites than just about anything else. If I hit that bait up against a stump and it kicks out, bam, that causes a reaction strike, and that's when the bass gets it. Or if I get it into a grass clump and rip that bait out, bam, that's when that bass typically gets that bait. Now, most of the time, if you can deflect your squarebill off of cover of some sort, you're going to catch fish on a bait. But something that kind of helps me, I think, to get a couple of more bites is anytime I'm actually fishing a squarebill, something that I really like to do is actually kind of sweep the rod tip. If I'm fishing it around a laydown, or if I'm fishing it down a riprap bank, I really like to kind of sweep that rod and just let that bait kind of hit off rocks and stop and pause and shoot back, and just kind of keep it doing a lot of different things. Anytime you can pause that bait, stop it, make it deflect, those are all triggers for a bass that's going to help you to catch more bass on a squarebill. Now, if you guys kind of enjoyed a little bit more of this in-depth approach to a lure, I did the exact same thing with chatterbaits. And a chatterbait is one of my favorite lures. I'm gonna link that video right here if you guys wanna check that one out. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, comment below, and click those links down below in the description. Thank you guys for all the support, and I'll see you guys in the next video.